Hello everyone, this is Series Trivia and welcome back to our 10-part guide series covering reforms in Total War 3 Kingdoms. This episode is part 3 and will be an overview of the Red reforms. Let's get started. So in part 1, we established that there are a total of 16 Red reforms and that they correspond to the Vanguard class and their units. They also unlock military buildings, provide unit recruitment cost savings, boost replenishment and mustering rates, add military supplies, and increase campaign map movement. Today, we'll be going over all 16 of these reforms, but before we do that, I want to do the same thing we did with the green reforms and redraw the red reform portion of the reform tree to do away with the artistic branches and show clear lines of progression. There, this visualization of the red reforms look a lot cleaner to me. Not only does this showcase the line of progression, we are once again able to classify them into tiers and discuss them tier by tier. Before we do that, I want to bring attention to the Hierarchical enfeoffment reform in the bottom right corner. I have this reform highlighted in green because this reform requires the green agricultural garrison reform to unlock. We briefly mentioned this in the previous parts of this series, that because of the Wuxing synergies, there is always one branch of each color that leads to the reform of the next color. Now we can start discussing the red reforms individually, tier by tier, starting with tier 1, which just has one reform in the regional commissioners. This is not only the starter reform for one branch of the red reform, but rather the starter reform for the entirety of the red reform. If you want to unlock any red reforms, you have to unlock this one first. So this reform, along with all red reforms, requires no prerequisite buildings to build. Also, if your faction's intended playstyle is deemed militaristic, then this will be your free starting reform. Next, we move on to the tier 2 reforms, which there are two. They are the military market and the garrison conscripts. Military market might not seem like much of a reform by itself, but it is the true linchpin of the red reform. Well, you can argue that the regional commissioners reform was the linchpin, but that's unfair since all the reforms are linked to that one. Military market instead simply plays an outsized role, as we can see here. Garrison conscript does not have the linchpin role that the military market has, but it does provide a much more powerful buff by reducing the cost of constructing military buildings by 25%. This is a very strong buff, and if you're planning to focus on building militarized commanderies, this reform is a must. We can see here that this reform also unlocks a building. Once again, we're not going to be talking much about building and unit unlocks, as we have part 7 and 8 planned for that. Next, we can look at the 4 tier 3 reforms, starting with provincial military forges. This reform enables one of the most powerful cheese mechanisms in the game. By providing 20% redeployment cost reduction, this reform is the key piece of the puzzle for free teleportation strategy that you can employ in the game, where you can freely teleport full armies across the map at no cost. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then just hold on until part 9 and 10 of this series, where we'll dive into these and more advanced stuffs. In the meantime, just know that this is a powerful buff, which makes the provincial military forge a high priority reform. Following that, we have the supply canals, which increases your max army size and your seasonal retinue deployment limit. Both of these are lackluster buffs, but supply canal is a prerequisite for a powerful tier 4 reform in the Green Dragon supply ship reform, so it does have some value. Next up is the retainer armies, which does not look like much on paper, as it only provides an 8% discount for recruiting melee infantry and 8 points of satisfaction for vanguards. But like the tier 1 regional commissioner, which only provided an 8% discount to recruitment, the strength of this reform comes in that it's able to unlock a multitude of high tier branches, so it is just as important as a reform with better effects. Lastly, we have the convict draft, which is a rather useless reform because peasant units are really underwhelming and I have yet to find a use for them in the game. The reform only provides a mustering turn bonus and a starting rank boost for peasant recruits. With that, we can move on to the 5 Tier 4 reforms, starting with the before mentioned Green Dragon supply ship, which builds on the provincial military forge reform earlier and provides another 20% redeployment cost reduction, along with adding 1 army and 25% movement range for traveling in friendly sea regions. The only boost worth talking about here is the redeployment cost reduction, since it adds to the prior reform and brings the total to 40% from just reforms. Next, we have the Strategic Fortresses reform, which, like its prerequisite reform of Supply Canal, is not a great reform on paper, but as it only provides 8 military supply and 12 points of satisfaction to vanguards. But it still has value, as it unlocks a more powerful reform down the line. Following that is Shock Warfare, which has no passive buffs, but does unlock a nice unit and a key county upgrade, so we don't have much to say about it here. Hereditary Buchu provides a mustering turn boost and an extra rank to melee cavalry, which is a yellow unit. This is a bit surprising, but given that this branch splinters off Retainer Army reform, which will eventually support the yellow reforms, and leads to a reform that requires green reform to unlock, it's not that surprising. This reform is simply a confused reform stuck between all the different Wuxing synergies in the game, therefore the buffs just doesn't make much sense here. Regional Levy is our last Tier 4 reform, and it provides a strong 10% replenishment buff. Even though it is a Tier 4 reform, it has 5 reforms as prerequisites, so it is a difficult one to rush for, as the reward of 10% replenishment faction-wide for the rest of the game is a great one. Finally, we are at the 4 Tier 5 reforms. Aside from the extended conscription period reform, I see outstanding value in all the other reforms. We can start with the Swiftness is the Key reform, which adds 15% campaign movement range for all your armies. This can help you outmaneuver enemy armies, set up ambushes, and blitz undefended settlements. Next, we have the Bardet Mount, which decreases the cost of cavalry recruitment, adds an additional rank for shock cavalry, which are the red cavalry, and unlocks the level 5 horse pasture specialty county, which also provides discount to recruitment and upkeep costs of cavalry unit. So there is a lot of natural synergies at work here, and is a must-have reform for factions focusing on cavalry like Ma Teng, Dong Zhuo, and Cao Cao, and Gong Sun Zan as well. And it just happens that these factions are northern factions with access to horse pasture, so it all works out, giving this reform a high priority in the red reform tree. Next, we have the Hierarchical Ineffement reform, requiring the green agriculture garrison reform to unlock, and this enables the red dragon unit. It also reduces retinue upkeep by 10%, which can be a big deal in the late game when you're running a lot of armies. You can see this kind of as build 10 armies and get the 11th one for free type of deal. So it's pretty good in the late game, but probably not something worth rushing for in the early game, as you could rather use those reforms to build up your economy that will support a lot more army for you in the early game. Lastly, we have the extended conscription period reform, which I think is totally useless. It provides a tiny 8% discount to spear infantry, which are green units, and a +1 starting rank for melee infantry, which can be green or purple units. Thematically, this reform just seems lost as a Tier 5 red reform, and should be avoided unless you're going for an all-reform achievement. Just get the regional levy for 10% replenishment, which is the prerequisite reform for this, and stop. Now that we have gone through and talked about all the reform individually, let's take a step back and look at the big picture. Because of how the lines of progression work in the game, at the end of the day, we still need to be focusing on branches and not individual reforms. So let's take a look once again at my rendering of the red reforms. And this time, instead of categorizing the reform into tiers, we'll be classifying them into different branches. First, you have the Green Dragon Supply Ship branch, which I like to call the Redeployment Teleportation branch. By unlocking this branch, you'll gain all the listed buffs, but most importantly, you gain the 40% redeployment cost reduction that you need to beam your units up, Scotty. Next, we have the Campaign Movement branch, which ends in Swiftness is the key. 60% of this branch is shared with the prior branch, which will be a trend here with how the red reforms are set up. So a lot of the buff in the branch are identical to the prior branch. The key boost here that's different is the 15% campaign movement range. It's not only a gameplay reward, but also a quality of life reward, since it's painful to watch your armies march through terrible terrains or across all of China in the late game. Although, if you did go for the Green Dragon Supply Ship branch, maybe you don't need this branch, because who needs to march when you can teleport? Next, we have the Bardet Mount branch, or as I like to call it, the Horse Pasture and Cavalry branch. With the proper faction leader, heir, and prime minister buffs, and the control of the 4 northern horse pastures, these reforms can give you free cavalry units. Just think of the sight of your endless horde of shot cavalry appearing at the edge of the map, like in Return of the Kings. It's giving me chills and excitement to pick up this branch. Moving away from that imagery is the Need Green to Save Green branch. This branch that ends with Hierarchical in Efflement needs the Green Agriculture Garrison, so it's the Need Green branch. It also features a 10% discount to unit upkeep, so it's also the Save Green or Save Money branch. Lastly, we have the Trash branch of the Red Reform, or the Too Much for 10% branch. You need 5 reforms to reach Regional Levy to acquire the 10% replenishment. That is at least 30 turns invested to get a boost that is situational in terms of usefulness, as replenishment's usefulness correlates inversely with your skill on the battlefield. Meaning, if you do very well on the battlefield, replenishment is not a useful stat for you. And if you're struggling on the battlefield, it's useful, but you're kind of in trouble as well. Extended conscription period, which is the ultimate reform in this branch, requires another 5 terms on top of the regional levy requirement and doesn't add any significant boost that synergizes with any other red reform themes. So this is a largely useless branch for the red reform. With that said, this concludes part 3 of the series covering the red reforms. I hope you can take something learned here to add to your game, and look forward to having y'all back in part 4 as we move on to the yellow reforms. Once again, if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel to receive notification of the latest episode, guides, and Let's Play videos. I also take requests in the comment section for other guides, as well as welcome general suggestions to improve this channel, so please feel free to leave a comment. I hope you have enjoyed this video and see you next time. Bye!